Every murder investigation begins with one question. When? When did the victim die? When were they last seen alive? When did someone notice they were missing? Because time doesn't just measure hours and minutes. Time reveals patterns. Time exposes lies. Time creates alibis, or destroys them. In Kurt Cobain's case, the official timeline seemed simple. He left rehab on April 1st. He returned to Seattle. He isolated himself in the greenhouse room. He died on April 5th. His body was discovered on April 8th. Case closed. But when you examine those 72 hours minute by minute, something becomes clear. The official timeline doesn't just have gaps, it has impossibilities. Events that couldn't have happened the way we've been told, evidence that contradicts the accepted narrative at every turn. This is part 5 of our investigation. We've examined the coffee cups, the ignored evidence, the suspects with access, and the witness who saw someone leaving the property. Now we're going to put it together, hour by hour, day by day, building a timeline that reveals what really happened during Kurt Cobain's final days. And what this timeline reveals will change everything you thought you knew about April 5th. Let's start at the beginning. Friday, April 1st, 1994. According to official accounts, Kurt Cobain walked out of the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles. He checked it just days earlier for drug treatment. But on April 1st, he left, checked himself out, disappeared. Courtney Love has stated she was in Los Angeles during this period. She claims she was trying to find Kurt, worried about his safety, desperate to get him back into treatment. According to her account, she had no idea where he'd gone after leaving Exodus. But here's what we know for certain about April 1st. Kurt purchased an airline ticket. He flew from Los Angeles to Seattle. He arrived at SeaTac Airport sometime that evening. And then, according to the official story, he made his way to the Lake Washington house. But did he? Because there's no confirmed sighting of Kurt at the house on April 1st. No neighbor saw him arrive. No one reported seeing his car return to the driveway. The house, by all accounts, appeared empty. Which brings us to April 2nd, Saturday. And this is where the timeline starts revealing its first major inconsistency. On April 2nd, according to financial records that Tom Grant obtained during his investigation, Kurt Cobain's credit card was used at a Seattle hardware store. The transaction occurred in the afternoon. Approximately $50 was charged to the card. What was purchased? We don't know. The itemized receipt was never made public. Tom Grant attempted to obtain surveillance footage from the store that might show who made the purchase and what they bought. But according to his account, by the time he requested the footage, it had already been recorded over. The store's security system only retained footage for a limited time, and that window had passed. So, we're left with questions. Did Kurt use his own credit card at that hardware store? If so, what did he buy? Supplies for the greenhouse room where he allegedly planned to isolate himself? Tools for some other purpose? Or did someone else have access to Kurt's credit card and use it while he was somewhere else entirely? This transaction has never been adequately explained. It appears in financial records. It's documented. It's real. But what it means remains a mystery. Also on April 2nd, according to some reports, there was activity at the Lake Washington property. A neighbor later told investigators they noticed someone near the house that day, though they couldn't identify who it is from a distance. They didn't think much of it at the time. People came and went from the Cobain property regularly. But in retrospect, after Kurt's body was discovered, that sighting took on new significance. Was Kurt at the house on April 2nd? Was someone else there? Were they together? The official timeline assumes Kurt was alone in the greenhouse, but this neighbor's account suggests otherwise. April 2nd is also significant for another reason. This is one of the last days anyone can definitively place Kurt alive. After this date, confirmed sightings become murky. Accounts contradict each other. The timeline fractures into competing versions of events. Now we move to April 3rd, Sunday. And this is the day that would later become crucial to understanding how Kurt died, because this is the day the weapon was acquired. According to Dylan Carlson's own statements over the years, Kurt contacted him on April 3rd and asked for help purchasing a shotgun. Kurt claimed he wanted it for home protection. He was worried about intruders at the Lake Washington property, but he didn't want to buy it himself because, according to this account, he was concerned that purchasing a firearm might trigger some kind of intervention given his recent rehab stay and history with depression. So Dylan agreed to help. According to his account, they went together to a gun store. Dylan purchased a Remington Model 11 20-gauge shotgun in his own name. He gave it to Kurt. They returned to the property together, or so Dylan has stated in various interviews. But here's what troubles some investigators about this account. If Dylan was with Kurt on April 3rd, if they spent time together, if Dylan had recently seen his friend, wouldn't he have noticed Kurt's state of mind? Wouldn't warning signs have been apparent if Kurt was planning to use that weapon on himself just 2 days later? Dylan has maintained he noticed nothing alarming. Kurt seemed relatively stable, perhaps troubled, but not actively suicidal. Dylan insists he believed the home protection story. He had no reason to think Kurt would turn that weapon pen himself, but some question this narrative. They point out that providing a firearm to someone recently released from drug treatment, someone with a history of depression and a previous suicide attempt just weeks earlier in Rome, should have raised red flags for any responsible friend. Dylan has never been accused of any wrongdoing. He's cooperated with authorities. He's maintained his account consistently over 30 years. But the timing troubles those who've examined this case closely. Why did Kurt Cobain need a shotgun on April 3rd? What changed that made him request this weapon at that specific moment? We don't have answers. What we have is documented fact. On April 3rd, Dylan Carlson purchased a shotgun that 5 days later would be found next to Kurt Cobain's body. Also on April 3rd, according to some accounts, there was additional activity at the property. Phone records show calls being made from the house, not to emergency services, not to doctors or crisis lines, various personal numbers, to friends, to acquaintances. Someone was in that house, using that phone, making calls. If Kurt was isolating himself, preparing to die, why was he making social phone calls? Who was he talking to? What did those conversations contain? These questions have never been adequately explored by official investigators. Then we reach April 4th, Monday, and this is where the timeline becomes truly strange. According to phone records that Tom Grant examined, multiple calls were made from the Cobain residence on April 4th. Calls to Los Angeles numbers, calls to local Seattle numbers. These weren't brief calls. They lasted several minutes. Someone was having extended conversations from that house. But here's what makes this significant. According to the official timeline, Kurt was alone in the greenhouse room by this point, isolated and deteriorating. Yet someone was making phone calls from the house. Long calls, casual calls, not the behavior of someone in the final stages of suicidal crisis. Also on April 4th, something else happened that's been largely overlooked. A delivery person brought a package to the property. According to later statements from this individual, they knocked on the door of the main house. No one answered. Standard procedure for that delivery service was to leave packages on the porch if no one was home. But according to this delivery person's account, they heard something when they knocked. Movement inside the house. Not random house sounds. Deliberate footsteps. Someone walking. Someone who heard the knock, but chose not to answer the door. The delivery person thought nothing of it at the time. Perhaps whoever was inside didn't want to be disturbed. Perhaps they were in the shower or on the phone. Perfectly normal explanations. But after Kurt's body was discovered days later, that delivery person remembered those footsteps. Someone had been in that house on April 4th. Someone who was avoiding contact. Someone who didn't want to be seen. If Kurt was isolated in the greenhouse room, who was walking around inside the main house? If he was alone, who was making those phone calls? If he was preparing to die, why hide from a delivery person? The official investigation never adequately addressed these questions. The delivery person's account was noted, but apparently deemed insignificant. Just another detail that didn't fit the suicide narrative and therefore got explained away or ignored. But some investigators believe April 4th is the key to understanding everything. Because April 4th is when the activity was highest. April 4th is when phone calls were made, when movement was heard, when the house showed clear signs of occupancy. April 4th is the last full day before Kurt allegedly died. And April 4th is also when, according to some theories, whatever happened in that greenhouse room was being planned or prepared. Now we arrive at April 5th, Tuesday, the day Kurt Cobain officially died, according to medical examiners who later estimated time of death based on the body's condition. But what actually happened on April 5th? Here's where the timeline becomes almost impossible to reconstruct with certainty. According to the witness account we discussed in Part 4, the unverified report of a neighbor who claims to have seen someone near the property, there was activity at the greenhouse early that morning. Someone moving with purpose, someone familiar with the property, someone who appeared to be leaving the greenhouse area sometime between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. If that witness account is credible, it means someone was at the greenhouse on the morning of April 5th. Someone who was there when Kurt died or shortly after. Someone who left the scene and didn't report what they'd found. But phone records suggest something else interesting about April 5th. According to some accounts, at least one call was made from the Cobain residence that day. A call to a Los Angeles number. A call that was answered. A call that lasted several minutes. Who made that call? Who answered it? What was discussed? These questions have never been publicly answered. The identity of the person on the other end of that line has never been disclosed. The content of that question remains unknown. But think about what that phone call means. If it was made on April 5th, the presumed day of Kurt's death, then someone was in that house, making phone calls even as Kurt lay dead or dying in the greenhouse room. Someone who had access to the house. Someone who knew numbers to call in Los Angeles. Someone who, for reasons we don't understand, didn't call emergency services, but did call someone in California. This phone call, if it happened as reported, changes everything about the official timeline. It suggests coordination. It suggests communication with someone far from the scene. It suggests this wasn't a simple case of a man isolating himself and dying alone. April 5th is also when, according to some theories, the crime scene may have been arranged. If someone was present when Kurt died, if they left fingerprints on the shotgun, if evidence of their presence hasn't to be concealed, April 5th would be when that happened. Before rigor mortis set in, before the body's condition made movement difficult, before someone else might discover what had occurred. But these are theories, not proven facts. What we know for certain is this. According to medical estimates, Kurt died on or around April 5th. According to witness reports, someone was seen near the property that day. According to phone records, calls were made from the house, and according to physical evidence, the scene was discovered 3 days later with anomalies that have never been explained. Then comes April 6th, Wednesday, and this is perhaps the most troubling day in the entire timeline. This is the day Gary Smith made his first visit to the property. He'd been hired to install security equipment. He'd been there before to assess the work needed. On April 6th, he returned take measurements and prepare for the installation work he'd complete on April 8th. Gary arrived at the property. He walked around the exterior. He was near the greenhouse room, the same room where Kurt's body lay, according to the official timeline. But Gary Smith detected no smell, no odor of decomposition, no indication that a body had been decomposing in that enclosed greenhouse space for approximately 24 hours. Gary Smith knew what death smelled like. He'd encountered it before in his years working in homes throughout Seattle. Death has a distinctive odor, particularly in an enclosed space, particularly after a day in spring temperatures. That smell is unmistakable, unavoidable. But on April 6th, Gary smelled nothing. The greenhouse room, to his awareness, seemed ordinary. He completed his measurements. He left the property. He had no idea what he would discover 2 days later. So how do we explain this? How could a body have been decomposing in that greenhouse for a full day without producing the odor Gary Smith would have certainly detected? There are only a few possible explanations. Either the medical examiner's estimate of death time was wrong, and Kurt hadn't died yet on April 6th, or the greenhouse room was somehow sealed in a way that contained all odor, which seems physically unlikely, or something about the scene's condition was different on April 6th than it would be on April 8th. Some investigators have suggested the most troubling explanation. Kurt wasn't dead yet on April 6th. He died sometime between April 6th and April 8th, a much narrower window than the official timeline tilnex. And if that's true, then everyone's alibis, everyone's statements about where they were on April 5th, suddenly become less relevant, because the critical period isn't April 5th, it's April 6th. The official investigation never adequately addressed Gary Smith's observation about the lack of smell. It's mentioned briefly in his statement, but it doesn't appear that investigators seriously considered what it might mean for the timeline. They'd already determined Kurt died on April 5th. Evidence that suggested otherwise got dismissed or explained away. But Gary Smith was certain about what he didn't smell that day, and his certainty raises questions that deserve answers. April 7th brings us to Wednesday, and according to all available accounts, April 7th was a day of complete silence at the Cobain property. No reported visitors, no phone calls made from the house that appear in records, no deliveries, no neighbors noticing anything unusual, just silence. Complete, total silence. If Kurt had died days earlier, the silence makes sense. Dead men make no noise. Empty houses show no activity, but some find this silence itself suspicious, because according to various accounts, multiple people were supposedly trying to reach Kurt during this period. Courtney was allegedly worried about him. Friends were supposedly checking on him. Private investigator Tom Grant was searching for him at Courtney's request, yet no one thought to check the most obvious place, Kurt's own house, until April 8th. No one drove by, no one knocked on the door, no one thought it strange that he'd been completely unreachable for days. The official explanation is that everyone assumed Kurt was hiding somewhere else. He'd run away from rehab. He was avoiding contact. He could be anywhere in Seattle or beyond. Checking his own house seemed pointless, because surely he wouldn't be somewhere so obvious. But critics find this explanation inadequate. If you're genuinely worried about someone's safety, you check everywhere. You start with the most likely places. You don't conduct an elaborate search of all Seattle while ignoring the person's own residence. So April 7th remains a day of questions. A day when, according to the official timeline, Kurt had been dead for 2 days. A day when his body lay undiscovered in that greenhouse room. A day when no one at all, thought to look in the most obvious place. Finally, we reach April 8th, Thursday. The day everything changed. Gary Smith arrived at the property around 8:40 a.m. He was there to complete the security system installation he'd been preparing for. He approached the main house, knocked, no answer. He hecked around the property, calling out, identifying himself. That's when he noticed the greenhouse door was slightly open. We've covered the details of what Gary found in previous parts of this series. Kurt's body, the shotgun, the blood, and those two coffee sitting on the table. But now, armed with the full timeline, Gary's discovery takes on new significance. Because according to the official timeline, Kurt had been dead in that room for 3 full days. But Gary had detected no smell on April 6th. The body's condition, according to medical examiners, was consistent with death occurring on April 5th. Yet witness accounts, phone records, and other evidence suggest activity at the property through April 5th, and possibly beyond. How do we reconcile these contradictions? How do we explain a timeline that seems to fracture at every point we examine it closely? If you're following this investigation and believe these timeline inconsistencies deserve deeper examination, comment below with your theories about when Kurt really died. Share this video so more people understand the unanswered questions, because the only way truth emerges is through collective scrutiny. The official timeline tells a simple story. Kurt left rehab April 1st. He isolated himself in the greenhouse. He died April 5th. Body discovered April 8th. Case closed. But the documented evidence tells a different story. Credit card activity on April 2nd. Shotgun purchase on April 3rd. Phone calls and footsteps on April 4th. Witness sighting and mysterious phone calls on April 5th. No decomposition smell on April 6th. Complete silence on April 7th. Discovery on April 8th. Each of these events, examined individually, might be explained away. Maybe the credit card transaction was innocent. Maybe the phone calls were automated systems. Maybe Gary Smith's nose was off that day. Maybe the witness was mistaken. But taken together, these events paint a picture that doesn't match the official narrative. They suggest activity when there should have been isolation. They suggest presence when there should have been absence. They suggest coordination when there would have been chaos. Time doesn't lie. Timelines reveal truth. And this timeline reveals something the official investigation either missed or chose not to pursue. Something happened during those 72 hours that we haven't been told. Someone was at that property. Someone made those phone calls. Someone left that greenhouse room and secured the door from outside. The question isn't whether the official timeline has problems. The documented evidence makes that undeniable. The question is, what really happened during those 72 hours? Who was there? What were they doing? And has the true timeline been obscured or ignored for 30 years? We've built the timeline. We've documented the inconsistencies. We've raised the questions that should have been asked in April 1994. Now there's one more piece we need to examine. Because that phone call made from Kurt's house on April 5th, the call to a Los Angeles number, that call was answered by someone who knows what was said, someone who might hold the key to understanding everything. In Part 6, we investigate the phone call. Who was on the other end of that line? What did they know? And why has their identity been protected for 3 decades? The answers might finally reveal what really happened during Kurt Cobain's final hours. Subscribe now so you don't miss Part 6. The timeline has shown us when. Now we need to discover who, and that phone call might be the evidence that finally answers the question that's haunted this for 30 years. What really happened to Kurt Cobain?